Hi guys, we're back to find out what happens when Philip goes to get the powder from Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. So let's continue on. We're still on chapter 1. These are longer chapters. So here we go to find out what happens. Okay. A little after 5:30, Mrs. Carmody happened to look out the kitchen window. She saw Philip coming up the drive, followed by a crowd of children. On his head, he was carrying his shoe. Balanced on the toe of the shoe was a small jar. Sitting on the jar was a little green frog. I showed you guys this picture yesterday. There's the shoe, there's the mason jar, and there's the frog. He's showing off again. When Philip saw his mother's face at the window, he called out, "Hey, Mom, look it! Watch me, I'm going to jump over the wheelbarrow with all this stuff on my head." "Philip, don't!" his mother called. But he couldn't hear her, and she watched horrified as he made a run for the wheelbarrow, caught his foot in the garden hose, and fell backwards into the bushes. The small jar from Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle flew up in the air and landed on the concrete with a crash. Mrs. Carmody dashed out, knelt down, and began picking up little pieces of broken glass out of the spilled white powder. Having taken himself out of the bushes, Philip said, "Gee, Mom, I'm sorry I busted it. I didn't mean to." "Just don't talk," his mother said. "Go in, get me a clean white envelope out of my desk and the spatula off the stove. Hurry." While Philip was gone, Mrs. Carmody carefully pushed the white powder into the little mound and held her hand over it to keep the wind from blowing it away. When Philip brought her the envelope and the spatula, she scooped up all the powder into the envelope. All but half a teaspoonful. This she carefully lifted into the palm of her hand and blew it at Philip. Remember, this powder is supposed to turn him invisible, so we'll see if it works. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" he said, rubbing his eyes and coughing. "Something very wise, I'm sure," said his mother. Just then, Mr. Carmody's car turned into the driveway. Immediately, Philip jumped into the wheelbarrow and yelled, "Watch me, Dad. I'm going to stand on my head in the wheelbarrow. I'm going to stand on my head and say the alphabet backwards." Mrs. Carmody looked at the wheelbarrow, but it was suddenly empty. There was no one there. Not only that, but there was no sound either. Mr. Carmody got out of the car and said, "Where's Philip? Wasn't he just here a moment ago?" "Why, yes, he was," said Mrs. Carmody, smiling a secret smile. "Well, I want him to put the hose and that wheelbarrow in the garage," said Mr. Carmody. "I'll tell him," said Mrs. Carmody. "He should be back in a minute or two." She and Mr. Carmody went into the house and closed the kitchen door. Philip, quite red in the face from standing on his head in the wheelbarrow and all hoarse from reciting the alphabet backwards and forwards, he called after them, "Hey, Mom and Dad, look at me." But they didn't even glance at him. They acted as if they didn't even hear him. "Hey, you kids, look at me," he called to the children who had followed him home from Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle's. But nobody answered. They just turned and walked out of the yard. Slowly, he stood himself back up, climbed out of the wheelbarrow, and went into the kitchen. "How come you and Dad didn't watch my trick?" he asked. She said, "We didn't see you doing any tricks. Now go and put away the hose and the wheelbarrow and sweep up that broken glass. Dinner will be ready in about 5 minutes, and it's your favorite." "You mean frankfurters and baked beans and brown bread?" Philip asked. "That's right," said his mother. "Well, hot diggity," said Philip. Reaching into the broom closet, his mother took out the broom and dustpan and handed them to him. "Here," she said, very relieved that he was visible again. "Sweep up that glass first." Philip took the broom, held it up over his shoulders, and began making loud, zooming noises. "Hey, Mom," he yelled, "watch me, I'm a jet plane. Here I go for a takeoff." As he said, "Watch me," he began to disappear. With takeoff, he was gone. Humming happily, his mother took the lid off the steamer and poked the brown bread. At dinner, he disappeared 3 times. The first time was when he turned his chair around, crouched down on the seat, and said, "Look at me. I'm a big gorilla in a cage. Toss me a banana, somebody." He disappeared just after the words, "Toss me." Mr. Carmody almost jumped out of his chair. "Meg!" he yelled at Mrs. Carmody. "The boy's gone. There must be a trap door under that chair." "Now don't be hysterical, Jordan," said Mrs. Carmody. "He'll be back." And he was in about 2 minutes. The next morning after he was dressed, Philip climbed on the banister and yelled at Connie, "Hey, Connie, look at me!" "I'm sliding down the banister, frontwards sitting up." Then he disappeared and he didn't come back into focus until everybody else had finished breakfast. And his poached eggs were quite cold. His mother noticed he had a large purple bump on his left eye. As he slid into the chair, Philip said, "Nobody in this whole darn family cares what happens to me. My whole skull is probably cracked, but you don't even care." "Quiet," roared Mr. Carmody. Mrs. Carmody said, "Eat your eggs, dear. It's getting late." As she spoke to him, she leaned over and sprinkled some of the show-off powder in his hair. Turning around and giving her a suspicious look, Philip said, "What you doing to my hair, Mom?" "Oh, I'm just smoothing it down," said his mother, smiling. During geography, while Miss Periwinkle was standing with her back to the class, drawing a map on the whiteboard, Philip stood up on his seat, wiggled his ears, looked cross-eyed like this. Oh my goodness, I lost my place. Looked cross-eyed, looked like an ape, and scratched himself. All surefire tricks for making his classmates giggle. Nobody laughed at all. In fact, nobody even looked at him because he wasn't there. During recess, he put a whole package of bubble gum in his mouth and blew a bubble bigger than his head. But even though the children were all right around him, nobody pointed or laughed or even said one thing, because of course they could not see him. Then the bubble burst and got Philip's hair and his face all gummy. Then the children laughed because he was back in focus again. But Philip did not think it was funny at all, especially when the school nurse rubbed his face and neck and head with benzine that burned. There he is, trying to show off, but he's invisible, so nobody's even looking. After school, he didn't feel very funny. His head hurt, and so did his elbow, so he rode his bike home, sitting on the seat the ordinary way. Bobby Westover and Billy Markle rode beside him, and they talked quite solemnly about baseball, except once when Billy rode fast down Mission Hall with no hands, yelling, "Help! Help! I'm out of control! My engine's conked out! My landing gear's stuck! Call the crash crew!" Bobby and Philip laughed like anything until Mrs. Allen backed out of her garage and almost hit Billy, who couldn't stop and ran into a tree. Mrs. Allen turned pure white and shook, and she was so very mad. She said, "Billy Markle, I'm going to call your mother up and tell her what a little show-off you are. You almost got kicked, and you almost wrecked my car. You've practically given me a nervous breakdown." Billy, who was crying, said, "Well, look at me. My shirt's tore and my nose is bleeding and my bike's wrecked." Mrs. Allen said, "Go on into the kitchen. I'll fix you up, but don't bleed all over my clean linoleum." Bobby and Philip called goodbye to Billy, but he didn't even hear them. As they rode down the hill around the corner toward Philip's house, Philip said, "Poor dumb Billy. What a show-off." Chapter 2, The Crybaby Cure. We're going to read that part tomorrow. I do hope that you guys had fun at your field trip yesterday when you got to kind of listen to some storytellers. I know I'm not quite as interesting as them, but I do like reading to you guys, and I hope that you enjoy our book, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. We'll read chapter 2 tomorrow. Bye.